So I finally completed my Mario Kart vehicle series, at least for the time being. So as we wait for the release of the Switch 2 in Mario Kart World, I decided to make another Iceberg video. I really enjoyed making the SpongeBob Iceberg and learning about the creation and the more obscure facts of the show, which is why I would love to make more videos like that from time to time. Speaking of which, today's Iceberg will be covering video games that were originally cancelled, but will either end up going unreleased or were released years later on a different console. What really intrigued me about this Iceberg is just the story and creation behind most of these games. We know a general idea of what the game would have been like, as well as having some footage of the gameplay itself. However, for one reason or another, these games would never see the light of day in stores or on gaming consoles. It kind of creates a sad what-if scenario, since many programmers spent years working on some of these games, as well as fans also being excited about these projects as well. But with the game's cancellation, it obviously leaves gamers feeling upset, and it's fair to ask the question of what if the game released, and how would it be perceived today? Before we start the video, there are a few things I want to lay out. For one, I'll only be talking about games that were cancelled or would eventually come out years later on a different console. So I won't be talking about cancelled ports like Final Fantasy VII on the N64 or Half-Life on Dreamcast, since those games are playable on other platforms. I also won't be talking about most of the final layer, since most of the entries are either too vague or there isn't much information I could find. To offset this, I decided to add several entries of my own, so I hope that helps. Finally, I won't be able to talk about every cancelled or unreleased game, since there are hundreds of them. However, I will try to talk about the most notable games that will hopefully satisfy everyone. If there is a game you think I missed or forgot to mention, I might address those in a later video. With that being said, let's take a look at the cancelled games Iceberg. Silent Hills. Silent Hills is easily one of the most well-known cancelled games that fans really want to see released. It was originally supposed to be the 8th installment in the Silent Hill series. If you're familiar with the series, it basically revolves around the town of Silent Hill, which is known for having monsters as well as other anomalies. It's regarded as one of the best horror gaming series, due to its use of psychological horror as well as survival mechanics. Anyway, Silent Hills was greenlit by Konami in 2012 and was supposed to be developed by Hideo Kojima, who is known for developing the Metal Gear series, as well as being one of the most artistic and innovative developers of all time. The game was also supposed to be co-directed by Guillermo del Toro, who is best known for directing Hellboy. The artwork was also supposed to be done by legendary horror manga artist Junji Ito, best known for Uzumaki. The voice of the main protagonist was also supposed to be done by Norman Reedus, best known for playing Dale Dixon in the Walking Dead series. In 2014, a teaser for the game was released, titled PT, or Playable Teaser, with the short game receiving praise by both gamers and critics. You must be wondering, with the amount of talent behind the game, as well as PT doing good, why was the game cancelled? Well, in 2015, it was revealed that Konami and Kojima would have a falling out, which would result in Kojima and his development studio, Kojima Productions, leaving Konami, after the completion of Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. This would result in Konami removing all mentions of Kojima from their advertising, as well as the cancellation of Silent Hills, which really disappointed fans, since it was expected to be one of the scariest games of all time. Kojima, Del Toro, and Reedus would still work together after the game's cancellation, as Kojima would release his first game outside the Konami umbrella in 2019, titled Death Stranding, which would receive positive reviews from fans and critics, along with a sequel that is currently in development. After nearly a decade, there are still fans that want to see a Silent Hills release, which included a petition that received around 200,000 signatures, as well as rumors and speculation. However, with both Kojima and Konami moving on, the game's release seems unlikely, at least in the near future. Star Fox 2. Star Fox 2 was originally supposed to be the sequel to the SNES classic Star Fox, which at the time was known for pushing the Super Nintendo to its limit as being one of the first major 3D console games, as well as being a pivotal step in the future of the gaming industry. The Star Fox series was originally a joint project between Nintendo and the British video game studio Argonaut Productions. Argonaut would be known for creating the Super FX chip, which was used to help create 3D games as well as high-quality 2D games on the Super Nintendo. Nintendo was really interested in this, as they looked to push new gameplay styles and try to lead the industry in the future of 3D gaming. Star Fox 2 would implement an improved version of the Super FX chip called Super FX 2, which would have improved a lot from the original Star Fox. These improvements included a faster loading time, better graphics, real-time strategy, and the option to select from multiple characters, with each having their own unique abilities. However, the biggest improvement would be the game being more open world, as it gave players the freedom to travel and complete any mission at any time. There was also the introduction to Walker mode, which would turn the ship into a robot and allow players to battle enemies on land, which was viewed as very refreshing and an innovative experience. Star Fox 2 would actually be completed in 1995, with the game being shown at the 1995 Renta CES, as well as being promoted by Nintendo Power. However, when the game was nearing completion, Nintendo would ultimately cancel it for one simple reason. During 1995, two systems were released, being the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Both of these systems would implement 3D games that at the time were really impressive and praised by fans, especially the PlayStation, due to using CDs and having cinematic cutscenes. With the standard of 3D gaming changing in 1995, plus the fear of the Super FX 2 chip raising the price of the game compared to the cheaper PlayStation CD, Nintendo felt that the 3D experiment of the SNES should come to an end, but they still kept the game preserved. Nintendo will eventually release the N64 in 1996 to compete with the Saturn and PlayStation. In 1997, Nintendo will release Star Fox 64, which would use some of the mechanics in Star Fox 2. Star Fox 64 would go on to be the most successful game in the series, selling around 4 million copies. However, many fans were still upset at the last-minute cancellation of Star Fox 2. Between the late 90s and mid-2000s, many playable betas of the game would leak online, with one of the betas being a very close 90% completion of the game. But finally, after 22 years, Star Fox 2 would receive an official release in 2017, with the release of the SNES Classic Edition system. The inclusion was mostly due to the system's creator, insisting it should be included, since he thought keeping the game preserved, with no one to experience it, would be erased. Star Fox 2 would also release on the Switch's Nintendo Classics service in 2019, making the game easily accessible today. The game would go on to receive positive to mixed reviews, with people saying that it was innovative for its time, but would have looked inferior to the PlayStation games around the same period. However, many gamers were happy that Star Fox 2 would finally get to be experienced by the fans of the Star Fox series. It remains one of the rare examples of a cancelled game finally getting an official release years later. Star Wars 1313. Star Wars 1313 was a game that started development in 2012 by LucasArts. The game would have been a much darker and grittier depiction than the typical Star Wars game. The game would have focused on a younger Boba Fett exploring the dangerous undergrounds of the planet Coruscant, in an area known as Level 1313. It would also have direct involvement from George Lucas himself. Gameplay of Star Wars 1313 will even be presented at E3 2012, which would receive positive feedback being compared to games like Uncharted. Fans were really looking forward to a more mature and grittier depiction of the Star Wars franchise. However, something important happened in October 2012, as the Walt Disney Company would purchase the rights of Lucasfilms in the Star Wars franchise for over $4 billion. This would result in Disney firing many of the employees at LucasArts in early 2013, basically demoting them to a licensing company. As a result, many projects at LucasArts were cancelled, including Star Wars 1313. Some people at Lucasfilms, including President Kathleen Kennedy, state that the game is technically on hold and that it could be developed by an external developer. However, after 12 years with hardly any new updates, it's safe to assume that the game probably won't be released anytime in the near future, if at all. Which is a shame, since many fans were looking forward to it, but at least it wasn't the worst thing Disney did to the Star Wars franchise. Star Wars Battlefront 3. Battlefront 3 was supposed to be the follow-up from the success of the Battlefront series in the mid-2000s. The first two Battlefronts were developed by Pandemic Studios. However, the third installment was going to be developed by Free Radical Design, best known for the Time Splitter series. Battlefront 3 would have built up from the previous installments, which included better graphics, a larger character roster, and more online capabilities, but the most important feature would have been an enhancement of spaceship fighting. However, after 2 years of development, Battlefront 3 will ultimately be cancelled in 2008. There are many arguments as to why it was cancelled, with Free Radical Studios co-founder Steve Ellis claiming that the game was practically finished, but LucasArts didn't want to spend money advertising it. However, an unnamed LucasArts employee would come out and say that Free Radical Studios could not devote sufficient resources to the game and regularly missed deadlines. There was also concern within LucasArts, as Free Radical Studios' 2008 release of Haze would receive mediocre reviews at best, plus with the recent change in leadership in LucasArts, they were afraid of Battlefront 3 being a mediocre title. Several gameplay versions of Battlefront 3 were released throughout the years, with the biggest development being the release of a playable Wii version of the game in 2024, which was a beta build a week before its ultimate cancellation. Among Us 2. Among Us is a very popular online game developed by Innersloth and released in 2018, but reached its peak in 2020 due to the pandemic. If you somehow haven't heard of the game before, Among Us is basically a survival party game, where you either be assigned the roles of a crewmate or imposter. The crewmates will usually work on completing tasks on the ship, while the imposter would try to murder them and get away with it. There's usually reports after a body is found, and players will debate on who's the imposter and try to eliminate them. This will make for interesting gameplay, as the imposter can also lie and deceive players, which makes you think about your next move carefully. Anyway, during Among Us's peak, Innersloth announced the development of Among Us 2 in August of 2020. However, about a month later, Innersloth would cancel the sequel, state that they rather focus and improve from the already beloved game. Among Us 2's development only entered brainstorming mode. However, many ideas from the game will be added in future updates, which would include expanding game servers to 15 players and more roles for crewmates and imposters, as well as having more than one imposter per game. So while Among Us 2 never happened, many of its ideas were still implemented. Doom 4 Original Version. Doom 4 was supposed to be the next installment of the Doom series, being developed by id Studios and published by Bethesda. The Doom series is known as being one of the most influential games in the 90s due to its innovative gameplay and solid use of modding and online play. Doom 4 was announced in 2008 and was originally supposed to deviate a lot from the previous installments, as the game was supposed to have a narrative focus, as it was about a conflict of demons conquering the world and the protagonist battling the theme of survival. The game was also supposed to be more realistic graphic-wise, as well as have a more open world. Many fans were turned off by these decisions, since it deviated from what made the Doom franchise popular, with the idea being compared to a generic Call of Duty clone. The game went into development hell, as id Studios and Bethesda didn't know what direction the game should go in, as the gaming industry was moving towards more fast-paced action games. It also didn't help that another id and Bethesda game was released in 2011, titled Rage, which would receive mediocre reviews, and the feeling that Doom 4 might suffer the same fate, the game was put on hold. Finally, in 2013, the development of Doom 4 was completely scrapped, as id and Bethesda would try to make a Doom game that would be received well by the public. 3 years after Doom 4's cancellation, id and Bethesda would finally release the next Doom title, be produced installment in over a decade. Doom 316 will receive positive reviews, and as of today, the Doom series is doing pretty well, having a new game that recently came out, so in the end, ditching the original Doom 4 was a smart idea. Fez 2. Fez 2 was supposed to be the sequel to the betrayed 12 indie classic Fez. The game was a puzzle platformer that is universally praised for having interesting puzzles and its use of 2D gameplay inside a 3D world, which would help inspire similar games like Monument Valley. In June 2013, the development of Fez 2 would be announced. However, similar to Among Us 2, the game would be cancelled a month later. The reason for the game's cancellation was due to the game's developer, Phil Fish, not only leaving the game's production, but also leaving the gaming industry entirely. Many at the time thought this was due to Fish's Twitter argument with video game journalist Marcus Beer. They were arguing about the recent changes of Xbox One's self-publishing policy, with Fish criticizing the direction and negativity of the industry. A decade after the game's cancellation, Fish would do an interview stating that the main reason he left the game was due to him lacking the motivation to make a sequel, and they used his argument with Beer as an easy out. He would also state that he was tired and frustrated after he became a public figure, and that he didn't like the obligation to build on Fez's success by creating a sequel he had no interest in. Which is understandable, since artists and creators experience burnout and lack of enthusiasm, especially in demanding jobs like animation and video game development. While Fez 2's release is highly unlikely, it starts to see the inspiration of the game spread, and as a result, will lead to similar games being made and loved by fans today. Prey 2. Prey 2 was supposed to be the sequel to 2006's Prey. Developed by Human Head Studios, Prey was an instant success due to the game's unique ideal of a Native American battling aliens, as well as its unique portal and gravity gameplay. After Prey's success, Prey 2 would be announced to start development in the same year. However, there would be some trouble, as Human Head had problems finding a publisher. In 2008, the game was announced to be published by Radar Group, but in 2009, Radar would sell the rights of Prey to ZeniMax Media, and would be published under Bethesda. During that time, the developers didn't really have an idea of what the game should be like. Originally, it was supposed to be a continuation of the first Prey, with Tommy continuing his adventure. However, the game would later focus on a new character, as well as being a third-person open-world game, similar to the recent success of Red Dead Redemption. Bethesda announced the game's development in 2011, with a planned release in 2012. However, the game would enter development hell, as Human Head Studios' development of the game would come to a screeching halt. After the deadline, Human Head would leave the game's development, and Bethesda would look for another developer. There were reports of Bethesda targeting Arcane Studios as the developer, but nothing would ever come from this. Finally, in 2014, Bethesda would announce the cancellation of Prey 2, saying that the development never really went anywhere if that wasn't up to their standards, but they still kept the door open for future games in the franchise. In 2016, Bethesda announced a Prey reboot that would be developed by Arcane Studios. The game would release in 2017 and would be different from the original Prey, with it being a sci-fi RPG about aliens invading a space station, instead of the FPS alien abduction story in the original. Prey 2017 would go on to receive positive feedback from fans. There are rumors to the development of the original Prey 2, like Bethesda potentially buying Human Head Studios, as well as the studio stopping development of the game as a form of protest, but that's an entirely different video. I think Prey 2 is an interesting story, since it highlights the potential drama and controversies when it comes to game development. StarCraft Ghost. StarCraft Ghost was supposed to be the next installment in the StarCraft series by Blizzard Entertainment, following the success of the first StarCraft, as well as its many spin-offs in the 90s. StarCraft was praised as being one of the first major real-time strategy games, as well as expanding online gaming, along with its very unique and interesting sci-fi setting. Anyway, StarCraft Ghost will officially be announced in 2002, and that will be co-developed by Nihilistic Software, with the plan to release the game for GameCube, Xbox, and PlayStation 2 near the end of 2003. However, the game will face constant delays, and in the middle of 2004, Nihilistic Software will leave the project. Blizzard would state that they did what they were contracted for, and that the release of the game was still planned sometime soon. Blizzard would then collaborate with Swingin' Ape Studios to work on the game in July 2004. They would even go on to buy the company around a year later. But yet again, StarCraft Ghost would be delayed to September 2005, with Blizzard announcing that the GameCube version was cancelled due to the system's lack of online support, but the Xbox and PS2 versions was still planned. However, in 2006, StarCraft Ghost was finally postponed indefinitely, as the 7th generation of consoles were merged, with the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii releasing around 2006. Blizzard would say that they still had high hopes for the game. But as the years went on, little to no news was revealed about StarCraft Ghost, with many considering the game vaporware. Finally, in 2014, Blizzard would officially announce that the game has been cancelled, which really disappointed fans of the franchise, as StarCraft Ghost had a lot of promise of being a great game, due to the game's story, as well as its use of action stealth gameplay, and the protagonist's use of psychic abilities. In 2016, a Polygon article suggested that the game was close to being finished in 2005. However, with the release of the PS3 and Xbox 360, Blizzard didn't want to put a lot of resources in making Ghost work on next-gen consoles. Blizzard will also shift the majority of their focus on their recently released PC game, World of Warcraft, which became an immediate success, making StarCraft Ghost not as big of a priority. In 2003, a beta of the Xbox version of StarCraft Ghost will leak online, giving fans some closure. However, it is still disappointing that the game would never see a proper release, especially one with so much potential. WWE 2K21. WWE 2K is a game released annually under the partnership of WWE and 2K Games. The games will focus on the history and current events within WWE, showcasing the current roster of SmackDown, Raw, and NXT wrestlers. These games were usually released without much trouble, with only having slight adjustments as new wrestlers will show up and others leaving, as well as each new installment highlighting the career of future legends like John Cena and Roman Reigns. However, 2003 will be an exception, as WWE 2K21 will ultimately be cancelled. This was slightly due to COVID's impact on the gaming industry, as well as rapid roster changes due to mass firings and the emergence of a new wrestling company named All Elite Wrestling. However, the main reason for 2K21's cancellation was due to how awful and glitchy WWE 2K20 was. There are too many glitches to name, but some of them included messed up character models, wrestlers contorting mid-match, and matches being cut or abruptly ending. After receiving backlash from fans, 2K would announce that they would cancel plans to release 2K21 and would focus on improving the game's engine. They would release WWE 2K Battlegrounds in its place, which would receive mediocre reviews at best. WWE 2K22 would release a year later and would go on to receive positive feedback from fans, as it fixed a lot of the problems from 2K20. Ever since then, the WWE 2K series will receive little to no controversy, which is kind of a shame, since the glitches in 2K20 were pretty hilarious. Resident Evil 1.5. Resident Evil 1.5 was an unofficial name for a prototype of Resident Evil 2. The game was supposed to release in 1997. However, when the development of the game was nearly 80% completed, the development team would start to feel unsatisfied with the game. The game's producer, Shinji Mikami, would be quoted saying, "No one element was specifically boring, just everything as a whole," as well as saying that the game just wasn't fun. So after 1.5 was nearly completed, the development team would delay Resident Evil 2 and start from scratch. The Resident Evil 2 we know today would eventually release in January 1998, and would go on to be a commercial and critical success, being one of the top selling games on the PlayStation. While Resident Evil 1.5 and 2 have a lot of similarities, there are a few key differences, with 1.5 having less puzzles and focused on collecting key cards to unlock areas. Character roles would also be replaced, with the protagonist Leon Kennedy being a veteran cop in 1.5, but would eventually be a rookie in 2. Elsa Walker was also supposed to be the female protagonist originally, but would be replaced by Claire Redfield in the final game. Finally, the plot of Resident Evil 1.5 was supposed to be the series finale, in case the first Resident Evil game failed. However, with the game being a major success, the ending of 2 would be more open-ended. While Resident Evil 1.5 would never be officially released, a private collector would buy a 40% completion of the game in 2007, and in 2013 would be released to the public, with work being done by fans to eventually make a complete game. Capcom would also give a nod to 1.5 in the Resident Evil 2 remake, as they added a costume for Claire that is based on Elsa Walker, so while 1.5 was cancelled, its legacy still lives on today. Half-Life 3. Out of all the cancelled games, Half-Life 3 is easily one of the most well-known and anticipated games that fans really want to see released. The Half-Life series is often regarded as one of the most influential games in modern gaming, due to its unique gameplay style, its deep modding community, and advanced enemy AI. It will help make or inspire games like Portal, Counter-Strike, and Garry's Mod. Anyway, Half-Life 3 was intended to be the finale of the Half-Life trilogy, and wrap up all the loose ends from the cliffhanger of Half-Life 2. Valve originally stated that they planned to release Half-Life 3 by Christmas of 2007. However, besides some concept art being revealed in 2008, very few updates were revealed about Half-Life 3, with some people stating that the game became vaporware, so much so that it became a meme in the gaming community. Eventually, Valve would state that they stopped the game's development, saying that they didn't feel like the game really had any innovative gameplay mechanics, and that they would rather focus on more ambitious games and ideas. Over the years, more details about Half-Life 3 would be revealed, like the game taking place in the Arctic, and there being an ice gun that created barriers and ramps, as well as an interesting blob-like enemy. In 2020, Valve would release their next entry in the Half-Life series, titled Half-Life Alyx, which was a VR experience and a prequel to Half-Life 2. There have been recent rumors that Half-Life 3 might be released in one form or another, but until something is officially shown from Valve, I'd take any rumor with a grain of salt. Super Mario 64 2. As the name suggests, Super Mario 64 2 was supposed to be a direct sequel to the classic Super Mario 64. It was originally meant to be released for the Nintendo 64 disk drive, or 64DD for short. The 64DD was supposed to be an add-on to the N64 and would have been able to play more powerful games, as well as connect to the internet. However, the system will end up doing poorly in Japanese markets and will go down as a commercial failure, as the system will only circulate from December 1999 to February 2001. With the system's failure, Super Mario 64 2 would also be cancelled. Not much is known about the game, as only one prototype level unreleased to the public was made. However, it's said that the game was supposed to support multiplayer, with Luigi being playable, as well as players being able to ride on Yoshi. While Super Mario 64 2 was never released, it's theorized that many of the game's ideas will be incorporated in future 3D Mario games, like Sunshine, Galaxy, and Galaxy 2. Super Mario 128. Similar to the last entry, Super Mario 128 was a codename for a potential sequel to Super Mario 64. After the 64DD's failure, Miyamoto and Nintendo would target the sequel to Super Mario 64 on the next system, the GameCube. During Nintendo Space World 2000, a tech demo for the GameCube titled Super Mario 128 would be shown, as it focused on 128 Marios throwing boxes and walking around on a spherical surface. Miyamoto would say that he wanted the next Mario game to be treated more seriously, as he thought Mario was turned into a kids series. He wanted to do this by getting rid of Mario's smile, as well as his peace sign after celebrating. However, as the years went on, no new updates were provided about Mario 128. While Super Mario Sunshine would come out, it would be stated to be a different project entirely. Eventually, Miyamoto and Nintendo would move on from Super Mario 128, as they thought the game was becoming too complicated, and that they would incorporate ideas from 128 in future Mario and Nintendo games. While Super Mario 128 would never officially release, the tech demo would help inspire many future Nintendo games, with the rendering of 128 Little Marios helping inspire the Pikmin series. The physics and speedwalking of Super Mario 128 would also help inspire Metroid Prime, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, and Super Mario Galaxy. In fact, the director of Super Mario 128, Yoshiaki Koizumi, would also direct Super Mario Galaxy, so you could say that Galaxy is the sequel to Super Mario 64, which is pretty cool since Galaxy is a great and beloved game. Euro Zelda. Euro Zelda was supposed to be an expansion pack for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. It was supposed to be released on the 64DD, along with another Zelda project titled Zelda Gaiden. Zelda Gaiden would eventually be reworked into Majora's Mask. However, since the 64DD failed, Euro Zelda would be cancelled. Euro Zelda was said to include harder dungeon designs, as well as new enemies to fight. Eventually, with public demand and the game being nearly completed, Nintendo decided to add assets to Euro Zelda as a bonus disc for Wind Waker, titled The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Master Quest. While this did quite some fan sentiment, many were still disappointed at the result, as Master Quest would have the same megabytes as a regular Ocarina of Time cartridge, even though Euro Zelda was supposed to be an expansion pack. Plus, there were no new enemies in Master Quest, which made fans question its legitimacy. Over the years, there have been mods and projects trying to revive a complete Euro Zelda, which shows how innovative and passionate fans can be. Pocket Monsters RPG. This entry refers to a supposed Pokemon RPG that was planned for 64DD, titled Pocket Monsters RPG. The game was mentioned in 1997 by Shigeru Miyamoto, who stated that it was being developed by Game Freak, more specifically the Pokemon series creator Satoshi Tajiri. Later on that year, it was revealed that Pocket Monsters RPG would be able to store data for the new Pokemon games Gold and Silver, which were announced to release in 1998 at the time. Furthermore, it was announced that more Pokemon projects were planned for the 64DD. However, with the system failing, plans would change. Most of the Pokemon games announced for the 64DD were released on the N64, which included Pokemon Stadium, Pokemon Snap, and Hey You Pikachu. However, a game fitting Pocket Monsters RPG's description would never release. While an official reason for the game's cancellation was never revealed, there are a few things we can infer. For one, Game Freak was super busy at the time, as Gold and Silver was delayed and wouldn't release until 2000. It's also possible that Pocket Monsters RPG would have been too big on the N64, as well as a huge burden for Game Freak, since Pokemon Stadium pushed both the system and Game Freak to their limits. Game Freak's co-founder, Junichi Masuda, would also voice his opinion that Pokemon RPG games should remain on portable consoles. It's possible he could voice his opposition of Pocket Monsters RPG. However, after the GameCube's release, two Pokemon RPGs would release on the system, being Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. While they weren't developed by Game Freak themselves, as they were developed by Genius Sonority, it did show they were willing to experiment. With information about the game's fate most likely to remain unknown, fans will continue to speculate about the game by creating fan art of what the game could look like or theorizing about its fate. Kirby GCN. Kirby GCN refers to multiple versions of a mainline Kirby game that were planned for the GameCube during 2005. The game would have been about King Dedede stealing Kirby's Warp Star and Kirby trying to get it back. The first version of the game was a 2D game with 3D graphics, similar to Kirby 64 but Crystal Shards. The game would also include the buddy system from Kirby Superstar. However, this idea would be expanded by allowing up to 3 players to be able to control the buddies, as well as being able to ride on them and create special moves. The second version would be a 3D game, allowing Kirby to freely move around. However, this game became extremely challenging for Hal and was quickly scrapped. The final version would have been a more traditional 2D platformer and would have given Kirby super versions of his regular power-ups, as well as having treasure chests similar to Kirby's Squeak Squad. However, these 3 versions would eventually be cancelled on the GameCube due to difficulty designing the game for both single and multiplayer. Plus, with the upcoming release of the Wii in 2006, Hal would focus their efforts on releasing the next Kirby game for the Wii. Kirby's Return to Dreamland was finally released on the Wii in 2011 and would mostly resemble the third game, as it was also a 2D platformer with super power-ups. It also supported multiplayer like the first game. While the other 2 versions of Kirby GCN were cancelled, similar ideas for them would appear in future Kirby games, with Kirby Star Allies having a fun multiplayer mode similar to the first version of the game, where you can even ride on each other. Kirby the Forgotten Land would also be an open-world 3D game, similar to the second version of the GCN game, so it shows that while an idea might not work at first, you can always revisit it later and make a masterpiece. Gotham by Gaslight. Gotham by Gaslight was a game that was planned to be developed by Day One Studios and published by THQ in the early 2010s. The game would have been based on the 1989 comic of the same name. Like the comic, the game would focus on Batman exploring 19th century Gotham, where he tries to hunt down Jack the Ripper. The game would have also had a very unique Victorian era and steampunk aesthetic. There was also gameplay developed and used to pitch the game. However, the project was shortly cancelled after THQ failed to secure the rights from Warner Bros. While the exact reason for THQ not acquiring the rights is unknown, there are a few major factors that could have been in play. For one, THQ probably couldn't pay for the rights since they were struggling at the time and would eventually go bankrupt in 2013. Another reason would be in Warner's priorities and lack of faith in the concept, as Batman Arkham Asylum would release in 2008 and would go on to be successful and start the Arkham series. This would be Warner Bros.' top priority, as they offered a modern and mainstream Batman experience. Meanwhile, Gotham by Gaslight was more of a niche ideal, and would deviate a lot from what fans knew about the Batman franchise. So with the Batman Arkham series being popular, plus Gotham by Gaslight being a high-risk concept without guaranteed success, the project was quickly scrapped and forgotten about. While it's understandable why the project was abandoned, it still disappoints some fans, as they saw the game as a unique opportunity to show a new version of Batman never really explored before. Test footage of the game would leak in 2012, which would really get fans interested in the project, as they praised the footage for being unique and having a really cool aesthetic. While a Gotham by Gaslight game remains highly unlikely in the near future, the legacy of the story still lives on, as a Gotham by Gaslight skin will release as DLC in Arkham Origins, and would also be a skin in LEGO Batman 3. Earthbound 64. Earthbound 64, or Mother 3 as it was called in Japan, was supposed to be the third installment of the cult classic Mother/Earthbound series. Like many other Nintendo properties in the N64 era, Earthbound would also look to transition into 3D gaming. Development of the game would start around late 1995, and was originally planned for the 64DD, since it would allow for more content. However, with the 64DD eventually failing, development would focus on the base 64 going forward. However, with that transition came more problems, as the development team became overambitious and had to significantly downscale from their original ideas. The team was also unskilled in 3D graphics, as they only worked with 2D sprite games in the past, but they would eventually get better as development went on. A full trailer and playable demo would finally be featured at Space World 1999, with a planned release date of March 2000. However, the game would be delayed again, only being around 60% completed at the time. In August 2000, the game would officially be cancelled by series creator Shigesato Itoi, state that while Mother 3 might happen sometime in the future, it won't be on the N64. This was likely due to the upcoming release of the GameCube in 2001, and if Earthbound 64 released in 2001 or 2002, like it was projected at the time, it would have likely done poorly, as people would be focused on the more powerful GameCube. Mother 3's development would restart in 2003, and while there was talks of a GameCube release, the team decided to focus on the GBA, as it would have caused less stress, as well as focus on the 2D pixel style the series was used to. Mother 3 would eventually release in 2006, and would mostly have the same characters and story that were planned for Earthbound 64. However, the game would never see an official Western release, which has caused movements of fans begging Nintendo to bring the game to the Western market that still lasts to this day. While it's good that Earthbound 64 would finally see some closure, it would have been interesting to see how a 3D Earthbound game controls and feels like. Also, Nintendo, please add Mother 3 to the Switch's GBA Online library. Banjo 3E. Banjo 3E refers to a potential third game in the popular Banjo-Kazooie series created by Rare. The idea of the game would gain prominence after a line at the end of Banjo Tooie where the villain Gruntilda would say, "Just you wait until Banjo 3E." However, the developers of Banjo Tooie would state that this was only a joke, as it was meant to make fun of how ridiculous Banjo 3E would sound. A similar joke would be used in an earlier Rare game, Snake, Rattle, and Roll. At Space World 2000, there would be a trailer shown of Banjo and Kazooie being chased by many of the series' characters. At the time, fans thought this was confirmation of a new Banjo-Kazooie game being developed for the GameCube. But again, this was only used to announce Rare's potential presence on the system, as well as showing off the GameCube's features, similar to Super Mario 128. In 2002, Rare would be bought by Microsoft for over $300 million, killing a future Nintendo and Rare projects. In 2008, the third Banjo-Kazooie game, titled Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, would release on the Xbox 360. While the game would receive good reviews, it was also a financial failure and would receive criticism from fans, as the game would heavily deviate from the previous two games, focusing on building vehicles instead of platforming. Nuts and Bolts would be the last Banjo-Kazooie game released, and besides a Smash appearance, they haven't really had a major impact for 20 years, making Banjo 3E's release highly unlikely. Call of Duty Vietnam. Call of Duty Vietnam was a game that was in development by Sledgehammer Games around the early 2010s. As the title suggests, the game was focused on the Vietnam War during the late 60s and early 70s. The game was intended to be the first third-person shooter in the series' history, with gameplay described as being similar to Uncharted. Missions would have also taken place in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. However, the game was cancelled 8 months later in 2011, as Activision requested Sledgehammer to help Infinity Ward with Modern Warfare 3. Sledgehammer would move on from Vietnam and go on to develop Advanced War. That same year, Sledgehammer would state that they'd like to revisit Vietnam at some point, and while there have been missions in Black Ops 1 and Cold War, a full Call of Duty game based on the Vietnam War has never been released. The future for a Vietnam War game remains unknown, and most of the development of the 2011 game would become lost, with only a few concept images existing. Project Titan. Project Titan refers to a game that was being developed by Blizzard in 2007. As I stated in my StarCraft entry, Blizzard's 2004 World of Warcraft would become a massive hit, becoming one of the first major massive multiplayer online games, or MMOs for short. However, when something becomes popular, there's always going to be competition to cash in on the success, so Blizzard decided to develop a new MMO to remain the leader of that genre in the future. This would result in Titan being announced in 2007. The game's goal was to be different from Blizzard's three main series at the time, being World of Warcraft, Diablo, and StarCraft, as well as maintaining long-term player engagement. The project will be led by long-term employees Rob Pardo and Chris Metzen, with a newly established team called Team 4. The original ideal of the game was that it was supposed to take place in 2070s, where players would play as superheroes who would fight bad guys during the night and work at mundane jobs in the day. The game was also said to have a skill tree, and points that help the players obtain different abilities depending on their class. However, this structure wasn't balanced, as there were classes and abilities that would have been overpowered. The development of Project Titan would be chaotic to say the least, as there were different opinions about which direction the game should go in, as Metsu wanted to focus on the superhero aspect of the game, while Pardo wanted the characters to be more like spies. There would also be major confusion about aspects of the game, like how the combat system would work and just the general vibe of the game. This led to Team 4 creating different ideals and versions of the game. Pardo was also described to be a poor leader, as many developers say they had a seagull management style. He also couldn't commit to a vision for the game and made the development process a complete mess. In 2013, Blizzard's management team would finally step in. This led to 70% of Team 4 either being transferred to other projects or being laid off, while the remaining members, led by Metsu and Jeff Kaplan, would try to salvage anything from Titan. As for Pardo, he took a sabbatical, as Blizzard believed his management of Titan was a major factor in the project's failure. Pardo would decide to ultimately leave Blizzard in 2014. The changes to the project and Team 4 would eventually lead to the cancellation of Titan in 2014, as Blizzard would lose $80 million throughout the game's development. Besides the game's messy development, Blizzard would also state that the game didn't really stand out from other MMOs at the time, and that it probably would have been a commercial failure. Project Titan's cancellation would eventually result in the creation of the popular 2016 game Overwatch, as some aspects from Titan would be transferred there, like the character Tracer, as well as the map Temple of Anubis. Overwatch would end up being a major success for Blizzard, and would follow a trend of similar games at the time, like Fortnite and PUBG, show that while Project Titan was a failure, it still had good concepts. Cheetahman 2. Cheetahman was a game series created by Active Enterprises. The games would usually focus on 3 anthropomorphic cheetahs fighting off other anthropomorphic animals, created by the evil Dr. Morbus. I want to point out that Cheetahman were trying to cash in on the success of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as not only are the Cheetahman martial artists who fight mutants, but they're also named after Greek gods, similar to the Turtles' names based on Renaissance artists. Anyway, the Cheetahman would make their first appearance in the unlicensed 1991 NES game, Action 52, which is essentially a collection of 52 games created by Active Enterprises. Action 52 is often regarded as one of the worst games of all time, due to most of the games either being mediocre at best or just downright unplayable. That's of course not mentioning its cheap looking cartridge and outrageous $200 price tag. However, out of all the games on Action 52, Cheetahman was considered the best and most prominent, though that is not saying much. Action Enterprises would even show more love to Cheetahman, as the game included a Cheetahman comic book and potential toy ideas, showing that they wanted to build up the series. This would include a sequel game titled Cheetahman 2 that was supposed to release in 1992, but the game would be cancelled for reasons that are unknown. However, 1,500 copies of the game would be found in a warehouse in 1996, making Cheetahman 2 readily accessible through ROMs and emulation, as well as the physical copy being a prized collector's item. Cheetahman 2 itself is an unfinished project that is full of glitches, as it's impossible to progress further than the 4th level, but there is a fixed version where you can play the 5th and 6th levels. The Cheetahman would make their last official appearance in the Sega Genesis version of Action 52. While the Genesis version is often regarded to be better than the NES version, it's still pretty mediocre overall. While the Cheetahman would fail at becoming a major series, they would gain prominence thanks to AVGN and the internet, and have the legacy of being one of the worst video game series of all time. Thrill Kill. Thrill Kill is a fighting game that was developed by Paradox Development, and was planned to release on the PlayStation in 1998. The game was originally supposed to be based on a Mesoamerican ball game, where characters would attack each other to try to get a ball into a hoop. However, the game's publisher, Virgin Interactive, wanted the game to be more violent. The game would later transform into a fighting game, with the story being about 10 people going to hell and have to fight to the death to be reincarnated. The game would have also been the first 3D fighting game to include up to 4 players, and instead of a life bar, the game would include a kill meter that would encourage players to cause a lot of pain to their opponents to fill their kill meter and perform a finisher known as a thrill kill. However, the most notable feature about the game would be its violence, as the game would include a lot of sexual and graphic content that at the time was extremely controversial. This was pushed by Virgin Interactive to make the game as controversial as possible, so that the game would receive more publicity and potential success. Paradox Development also did this to make their name more prominent. The strategy would work, as the game would gain a large following for its graphic content, as well as being named the best presented game at E3 1998. However, when the game was set to release, Virgin Studios' North American operation would be bought by EA. Shortly after their acquisition, EA would cancel Thrill Kill and refuse to sell it to another publisher, even though it was nearly complete. This was due to the game's violence and controversy, as well as the game's recent AO rating, which would have made it harder to sell in stores. Paradox Development would use the assets of Thrill Kill and develop Wu-Tang Shaolin style in 1999. Thrill Kill's story wouldn't end there though, as the developers would leak the game on pirate sites, making the game readily accessible and becoming a cult classic among many fans. Thrill Kill still has controversy to this day, as some consider it one of the greatest fighting games of all time, while others say it's extremely overrated. But one thing is clear, Thrill Kill is easily one of the most popular and controversial unreleased games in gaming history. Nintendo GigaLeaks. While not technically a game, the Nintendo GigaLeaks refers to a massive leak of Nintendo content that began in 2018 and ended in 2020. It's often regarded as one of, if not, the largest leak in video game history. Due to its size, I won't be able to cover everything revealed in the leaks, as that could be an entirely different video on its own. However, I will list the major discoveries for each series. For the Mario series, a model of Luigi was found in the Super Mario 64 source code, confirming a rumor many fans had for a while. There were also unused beta enemies like Blog and Motos discovered, as well as unused test rooms. In Super Mario World, a beta version for Yoshi was revealed, as well as unused animations like Mario punching Yoshi in the head to extend his tongue, Luigi giving the middle finger, and Bowser having legs. For Yoshi's Island, there was a prototype version of the game, originally called Super Donkey, which included a character that looked similar to Stanley the Bugman from Donkey Kong 3. There was also another beta version of the game found, which included a different UI, unused minigames, and even more beta Yoshi builds. Finally, for Super Mario Kart, early versions of tracks, as well as cut courses and unused battle items were found. There was also a version of Mario Kart 64 that included the SNES sprites in a 3D environment, most likely used for testing. For the Zelda series, source codes and early versions of A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time were found. For Ocarina of Time specifically, early builds of the Temple of Time and Kokiri Forest were found. New information about Euro Zelda would also be revealed, as it confirmed that assets from the cancelled project would be used in Majora's Mask and Master Crest. But what interested me the most was a cancelled Zelda game, most likely a remake of Zelda 2, intended for the Satellaview, a Super Famicom add-on that allowed users to download games from satellites. For the Pokemon series, several prototype Pokemon designs from Diamond and Pearl would be revealed, like Garchomp originally being red. There was also confirmation of a Pokemon MMO being proposed by IQ in 2004. But MMO would have had an offline mode on the GBA, similar to Fire Red and Leaf Green, where around 30 Pokemon would be catchable. The GBA would also be able to connect to a PC, where players can hatch eggs, have regional weather patterns, and online tournament battles, similar to Pokemon Colosseum. Assets for a cancelled SNES game called Dragonfly would also be found. The game would have been a simulation of fighting aircraft, as you'd focus on shooting down other aircraft fighters. However, this game would later turn to Pilot Rings, which focuses on recreational flying instead. Finally, some unused characters from Star Fox 2 would be found, like a female human pilot, as well as a female fox and other animals. There were more interesting things found, like high-quality voice clips from F-Zero X in Star Fox 64, as well as game source codes, game system prototype models, and more lost game concepts, like a hockey RPG. But again, that's an entirely different video on its own, and one I might cover in the future if you all want me to. Scalebound. Scalebound was a game that was being developed in 2013 by Platinum Games, who are best known for the Bayonetta series. The game idea actually originated in the company's foundation in 2006, however they decided to focus more on Bayonetta. They still had the ideal for the game in mind and tried to pitch it multiple times, but there was never any serious interest from anyone. That was until 2013 when Microsoft decided to be the publisher for Scalebound. Unlike previous Platinum games that focused on action, Scalebound would be more of an RPG game. It would have also been the highest quality game that Platinum Games would develop at the time graphics-wise. The game would have focused on the connection between a human named Drew and a dragon named Fubin, as they would explore the world of Draconis, fighting enemies and trying to survive. The gameplay would focus on the players controlling Drew and giving Fubin instructions during combat. Drew and Fubin would also have a strong bond, meaning that if one died, the other would also go down. There would also be more advanced techniques as well, like Dragon Link mode, where players can actually control Fubin. However, this would make Drew more vulnerable, making it harder to protect him. Drew would also have a Dragon Arm, which can scan enemies, release pulse energy, and heal Fubin. Drew can also turn into a Dragon Hybrid, which significantly increases his strength and abilities. Finally, armor and weapons can be equipped by both Drew and Fubin, and experience points can be gained through combat or by Drew healing Fubin. Fubin can also be 3 different types of dragons, with each having a unique energy attack. All of these features would make the gameplay interesting. Anyway, Scalebound would be announced at E3 2014, and gameplay would be shown at Gamescom 2015, along with confirmation of a 4-player co-op mode. The game was set to release on the Xbox One in 2016, but will get delayed to 2017. However, the game would officially be cancelled in January 2017. The cancellation was due to Platinum Games' inexperience with creating a game with online features, as well as there being major division between Platinum Games and Microsoft. In a trade interview, Platinum Games head producer and current CEO, Asuchi Inaba, will state that Microsoft owns the intellectual property of Scalebound, but they'd love to work on the game in the future if given the opportunity. While it's possible that a Scalebound game could release in the future, I highly doubt that it will be anytime soon. Kid Kirby. Kid Kirby is a cancelled SNES game that was being developed by DMA Designs, which would later become Rockstar North, who are best known for the GTA series. This would have been the only Kirby game to be developed outside of Japan had it been released. The story of the game would have focused on a younger version of Kirby trying to restart the Dream Spring after it stopped. Kirby would also have a different design, as he would have had a curl on his head. King DDD would have also been in the game as well, and similar to Kirby, he would be a lot younger and be referred to as Prince DDD. Besides those details, not much was known about the game for a long time. That was until ex-DMA game designer Mike Daly would create a Flickr account sharing info and assets from the game. According to him, Kid Kirby would have used the SNES mouse, and the goal was to click on Kirby and stretch and fling him to reach higher platforms, similar to Angry Birds. There were multiple reasons for the game's cancellation, from Nintendo feeling unsatisfied with the game's development, to the SNES mouse failing. Nintendo also wanted to prioritize the N64 more and move on from the SNES, making Kid Kirby's cancellation similar to Star Fox 2's. Besides some concept art and a scan of the game's instruction booklet, nothing else has been revealed from Kid Kirby. It has been stated that a playable demo exists, but with it being lost for nearly 30 years, it's most likely gone forever. Mega Man Legends 3. Mega Man Legends is a game series in the Mega Man universe, and is known for introducing the series to 3D gameplay. While the previous installments of Mega Man Legends didn't have the best sales, it still had a really dedicated fan base. In fact, Mega Man producer Keiji Inafune would actually get a lot of questions about Mega Man Legends 3 being made in 2007. See fan interest in the game, Capcom would announce that Mega Man Legends 3 was in development in late 2010, with it being planned to release on the 3DS. Capcom would even encourage fans to be active during the game's development, with them encouraging fans to submit designs for the new protagonist, Arrow, as well as other characters. There will even be an official Mega Man Legends 3 site, and a planned demo for the game that was set to release in 2011. However, the game would quickly be cancelled in July 2011, along with the prototype that was nearly complete. Capcom would say that the main reason for the game's cancellation was due to a lack of fan participation, especially in the development process. But there are a few other factors as well, like Inafune leaving Capcom in late 2010, as well as the 3DS originally having poor sales numbers at the time. Even though Mega Man Legends 3 was cancelled over a decade ago, there are still fans calling for the game's release. This includes making a Facebook fan page that received over 100,000 followers, as well as fan games inspired from found content. There have even been developers and employees from Capcom, including Inafune, state they'd love to see the game get finished sometime. Capcom has also teased the project as well, with employees encouraging fans to speak out about the game. While I don't know if it'll be released anytime in the near future, I would be surprised if a third Mega Man Legends game does get confirmed, especially if fan feedback stays strong. Super Mario Spikers. Super Mario Spikers has a very interesting story, since no one even knew about the game's existence until 2014, 7 years after it was quietly cancelled, which is strange how silent the development process was, especially for a series as big as Mario. The game was being developed by Next Level Games, who are best known for developing the Super Mario Strikers series, as well as the second and third Luigi's Mansion titles. In fact, Nintendo actually rewarded Next Level Games' success for the first two Mario Striker games by financing them to develop a Mario-themed volleyball game, being called Super Mario Spikers. Like with Mario Strikers, Next Level Games wanted Super Mario Spikers to include very physical and aggressive gameplay to make the game more engaging. They would accomplish this by having the characters hit wrestling moves on each other, which was inspired by a WWE game they were making at the time. However, Nintendo would be disappointed by this and cancelled the project entirely, stating that the game was too violent for their brand, as characters would forcefully slam each other on the ground, with Luigi even stomping on Mario's body, which is a step up from similar games like Smash Bros. And Mario Strikers. Besides some test animations and concept art, nothing else has been revealed about Super Mario Spikers. The series would eventually get their volleyball game in the 2011 release of Mario Sports Mix, developed by Square Enix. Donkey Kong Racing. Donkey Kong Racing was supposed to be a light sequel to Diddy Kong Racing, with the major difference being that Donkey Kong Racing would have focused more on characters familiar in the Donkey Kong universe. It would have also replaced the vehicles in Diddy Kong Racing to the many rideable characters throughout the Donkey Kong Country universe, which included Rambi, On Guard, Ellie, and potentially many others. The game would actually be announced at E3 2001, with even a concept trailer being shown. However, that would be the last thing ever shown of the game, as like I mentioned in my Banjo 3E entry, Rare would be bought by Microsoft in 2002, ultimately cancelling the game. Rare would use assets from Donkey Kong Racing and try to develop Saberman Stampede, but that game would also be cancelled due to a lack of focus in development and Rare's inexperience with the hardware. Sonic X-treme. Sonic X-treme is easily one of the most prominent cancelled games in history, as it would have a major impact on Sega, which would persist for years. Anyway, Sonic X-treme was being developed by the Sega Technical Institute, or STI for short. It was originally supposed to be on the Genesis as a successor to Sonic & Knuckles. However, with the rapid development of gaming and the emergence of the PlayStation and N64, Sega removed the game's development to the Saturn. Similar to Super Mario 64 and other gaming properties at the time, Sonic X-treme would look at introducing Sonic to 3D gaming. It was also going to be the signature game on the Saturn, and even had a movie plan that would have been produced by MGM. But there were many problems with the game's development, as many programmers and staff would leave STI, which included X-treme's executive producer, Michael Kosaka. Things would get even worse, as many executives from Sega Japan would scrutinize STI's work, saying that X-treme was too rough and buggy. Even Sonic's co-creator, Yuji Naka, would doubt the game's success. STI was able to release a demo of X-treme for E3 '96. However, shortly after that, one of the game's programmers, Chris Coffin, would catch a severe case of pneumonia. Game designer Chris Sin would also become extremely ill and was given only 6 months to live. Both would eventually recover. However, with extreme illnesses, high turnover at STI, and constant delays, producer Mike Wallace decided to finally cancel the game, with Sega making an official announcement in early 1997. The MGM film would also be cancelled as well, since MGM and their partner Trilogy Entertainment couldn't come to an agreement about the film's plot. Sonic X-treme's cancellation would also have a major impact on Sega, as it most likely led to the Saturn's failure. While there are good games that did replace Sonic X-treme, like Nights into Dreams and Sonic 3D Blast, they couldn't really replace the absence of a traditional Sonic platformer. Plus, with the PlayStation's massive success, Sega would start to fizzle out in the console wars. Sonic Adventure would finally release on the Dreamcast in 1998, being the first 3D Sonic platformer. However, it was a little too late, as the Dreamcast would be the last console Sega would ever make. Today, there are many playable prototypes of Sonic X-treme online, but most of them are pretty buggy and incomplete, but does give a glimpse into what the game could have been like, and helps pose the question, if Sonic X-treme did release, where would Sega be today? Metroid Dread. Similar to the last entry, Metroid Dread would also have an interesting development history. The game would originally be developed around 2005 by Metroid producer Yoshio Sakamoto. He wanted to expand the stealth sequences from Metroid Fusion, and use that to incorporate fear-based gameplay in the Metroid series, as Dread would focus on an enemy hunting down Samus, with the players trying to avoid them. Metroid Dread was expected to be a key release for the DS. After not hearing anything at E3 2005, fans expected to hear more about the game at E3 2006, as Nintendo Magazine stated that the game would release in November of that year. However, Nintendo would quietly pull the plug on the game and want to focus in a new direction. A second development attempt would begin around 2008, with even a playable prototype being shown to Nintendo staff at E3 2009. But again, development would be halted, as Sakamoto was disappointed at the development process. He also felt like creating the intimidating antagonist he was looking for would have been impossible for the DS hardware. Throughout the years, fans would start to get more invested in Dread, as it was described as one of the most desired games they wished Nintendo would release. Fans would even start to get mad at Nintendo for pretty much burying the project, especially after the disappointing release of Other M. However, after 16 years, Metroid Dread would finally release on the Nintendo Switch in 2021. This was due to the many years of fans clamoring for the game's release. Nintendo was also impressed with the development studio Mercury Stream's previous work on Metroid Samus Returns, as well as see what they could do with a Metroid game on the Switch. As of this video, Metroid Dread would be the most successful game in the series' history sales-wise. It would also receive great reviews as well. In fact, Dread was actually my introduction to the series, and I really enjoyed playing it, so I'm glad that a game as good as Dread was finally able to be released to the public after years of waiting. Anyway, that concludes part 1 of the cancelled video games Iceberg. To be honest, I originally wanted to cover the complete Iceberg in one video. However, with the Iceberg being much bigger than I expected, plus with the editing process taking a big hit on my PC's memory, I thought it was best to just split the video into 2 parts. Hopefully, I can release part 2 of the Iceberg next month. Then after that, I would love to start making videos on Mario Kart World, since I just recently got the game. That's pretty much all I have to say, so until next time, Koopa out.